Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to crack open compelling sources and get you well informed fast. Today, we're diving into a story that honestly still resonates years later. The spectacular collapse of Enron. So cast your mind back to 2001, Enron. It was the corporate poster child hailed as the company of the future. Then, boom, it just unraveled. It felt like a huge betrayal for a lot of people. Was it just, incompetence? Or was it outright corruption?
What's really interesting, and Malcolm Gladwell wrote about this in The New Yorker, is that the root cause wasn't just those things, important as they were. It was actually something deeper, more fundamental. A mindset, a deeply ingrained mindset that permeated the entire organization.
Right. And that's exactly what we're going to unpack today. How these different organizational mindsets, we're talking fixed versus growth, how they can really determine if a company thrives or if it crashes and burns like Enron. We'll look at how these mindsets affect the leaders, the employees, really the whole culture.
Yeah, we'll pull in some pretty striking examples, obviously Enron, but also companies that achieve, sustained greatness. We'll even touch on personal stories of some well-known CEOs. It's really about understanding the sheer power these mindsets have in the business world.
And crucially, we want to connect this back to you, the listener. How can understanding all this change how you approach your work, maybe your leadership style, even your own personal growth?
Okay, let's get into it.
Yeah.
So let's start down that perilous path of the fixed mindset with Enron itself. There was this dominant idea back then, pushed hard by McKinsey and Company, the big consulting firm. They called it the talent mindset. And it basically said, look, corporate success means recruiting outsized talent, almost like sports, right? Signing the naturals with these huge checks.
Enron didn't just buy into that, they worshiped it. They went all out recruiting people with, the fancy degrees, the impressive resumes. They believed that raw, innate talent was everything. But the unintended consequence was huge. They pushed their people into a fixed mindset. Okay, so what does it actually mean on the ground? When a company or its people are stuck in that fixed mindset, what are the real-world effects?
Well, our sources point to some revealing studies. For instance, people with a fixed mindset, they're constantly worried about looking deficient, right? So one study from the University of Hong Kong found they might actually refuse to take a course that would improve their English, just to avoid exposing a perceived weakness.
Wow.
Or another one found that when people are praised purely for their intelligence, like Enron's stars were almost 40%, would later lie about their scores, always upwards, of course, when they face really tough problems. They couldn't admit they struggled.
So the irony is just glaring. They focus so much on finding innate talent, but they create an environment where that talent can't actually develop or even be honest about challenges. What's the bottom line for the business then? For the company itself?
Well, as Gladwell concluded pretty starkly, when people are valued only for innate talent, they just crumble when that image is threatened. They'd literally sooner lie than admit a mistake or ask for help. And a company that can't self-correct, that can't face its errors and learn, well, it cannot thrive. Simple as that. Now, let's broaden the lens beyond Enron. Jim Collins, in his big Good to Great study, found a really powerful contrast. The leaders who took companies to sustain greatness, they weren't the flashy, charismatic types. They were consistently self-effacing, humble almost.
Not the big egos.
Exactly. Whereas the fixed mindset leaders he studied were driven by what he called a gargantuan personal ego.
That's a fascinating difference. How did that ego shape how they saw the company they were leading?
Often they saw the company as just simply a platform for their own greatness, a stage for them to shine. Some even kind of perversely set the company up to fail when their regime ended.
Really? Why?
As a twisted testament to your own personal greatness. Like, see, the company fell apart after I left, proving how indispensable I was.
That's something. And I guess that ego dictates a very specific way of managing people, too.
Oh, absolutely. Collins called it the genius with 1,000 helpers model. These leaders genuinely believed great geniuses do not need great teams.
Just a helper.
Just little helpers to carry out their brilliant ideas. They wanted to be the only big fish, which naturally stifles employee growth.
Yeah.
And it means they refuse to look at their own flaws or the company's flaws. Think about Kroger adapting to change while A&P just didn't. A&P had that fixed mindset at the top and it failed them.
It really makes you wonder, where did this whole CEO as superhero idea even come from, this larger-than-life corporate figure?
Well, James Surowiecki, writing in Slate, he traced a lot of it back to Lee Iacocca's rise. Before Iacocca, CEOs were mostly, bland and characterless organization men. Iacocca kind of turned them into superheroes. And this created a trend where other fixed mindset executives started vying for those labels, which arguably, contributed to a lot of the corporate scandals that came later.
Okay, let's dig into some of these fixed mindset leaders. Iacocca himself. At Ford, you said he craved approval, the royal trappings, called himself the crown prince. And to be fair, he achieved amazing things, like the Mustang.
Absolutely, he did. But that fixed mindset was always there. When Henry Ford II fired him, he was genuinely shocked and harbored an enduring rage, even though he himself fired people all the time. He just believed he was different, smarter, or luckier.
Hmm.
Years later, apparently, his second wife suggested he should thank Henry Ford for pushing him to achieve greatness at Chrysler. He divorced her. It shows how fragile that fixed self-image was.
And then, of course, he famously saves Chrysler, becomes this huge national hero. But what happened after that high point?
That need to prove his greatness just kept going. He started pouring company time and money into his public image, boosting the stock price, instead of investing in long-term stuff like better car designs or manufacturing.
So short-term focus again.
Totally. He got paranoid about underlings getting credit, so he stifled new ideas. When Chrysler started struggling again, he blamed Japan instead of actually improving the cars. He apparently became quite a petty and punitive tyrant. Didn't care much about sharing profits or worker conditions, but kept up his own regal lifestyle, like spending $2 million on his corporate suite at the Waldorf. Wow. And the final act. After retiring, he joined a hostile takeover bid against Chrysler. It just confirmed that for him, ego always came first.
That pattern is really stark. And we see echoes with Albert Dunlap, right? Chainsaw Al, famous for saving companies by, well, firing thousands and selling off the pieces. He made a fortune from Scott Paper and basically declared, I'm a superstar.
Yeah, his focus was purely making money. He dismissed any talk of stakeholders, employees, communities, forget it. The long haul held no interest for Dunlap. It bored him. His own book had a chapter called Impressing the Analysts, but nothing on, actually making a business work.
It tells you everything you need to know.
It really does. He operated from this belief in his inherent superiority, which meant he just opted out of the kind of learning that would have helped him succeed. His eventual failure at Sunbeam, inflating revenues, firing critics, it was almost inevitable.
And then we circle back to Enron's architects, Kenneth Lay and Jeffrey Skilling. Lay saw himself as the great visionary, right? Looked down on guys like Rich Kinder, who focused on, well, actual earnings.
Even though Kinder's work basically funded Lay's royal lifestyle, Kinder's was the one asking that famous question, are we smoking our own dope?
Yeah.
And Kinder, seeing how Enron undervalued its real assets, he smartly bought the energy pipelines when he left. That company, worth $7 billion just a few years later.
While Lay
was obsessed with being seen as a good and thoughtful man, even as Enron was, sucking the life out of its victims. And Skilling, he just believed he was smarter than everyone. Anyone who disagreed was simply not bright enough. He had this unlimited faith in his ideas.
to the point of delusion, it sounds like.
Pretty much. He extended that fixed mindset to believe his genius is profit. So Enron started booking millions in profits on deals before they'd made a single penny in real revenue.
Unreal.
And like Iacocca, he thought he was just luckier. To this day, denies anything was ever wrong.
It's amazing how consistent the pattern is, even across different people and companies.
It really is. Despite driving their companies towards ruin, these leaders felt invulnerable and invincible. They lived in this bubble, this world of personal greatness and entitlement. They consistently chose what would make them feel good and look good over what would serve the longer-term corporate goals.
Which leads to?
Predictable stuff. Blaming others, covering up mistakes, pumping the stock price, trying to crush rivals, and, yeah, often screwing the little guy.
Think of Lay taking huge personal loans from Enron, using the corporate jet like a taxi. Or Iacocca billing his executives for his own lavish Christmas gifts. It's pure entitlement.
And that must create an absolutely toxic place to work. Oh, completely. When leaders believe they're inherently better, they feel entitled to ignore the needs of the lesser people as they see them. It leads directly to brutal bosses.
We heard about Iacocca's painful games.
Right. And Jerry Levin at Time Warner, compared to Caligula, Skilling's harsh ridicule. Harvey Hornstein, an expert on this, points out this abuse isn't even really about performance. It's about the boss's desire to enhance their own feelings of power.
And they target competent people.
Often, yes. Because competent people pose the greatest threat to an insecure, fixed mindset boss. So the whole workplace transforms. Everyone's just worried about pleasing the boss, tiptoeing around. Innovation dies. You get this company-wide climate of fear about being judged. Think of those stories about managers at Chase Manhattan terrified of David Rockefeller, or how Burroughs and Texas Instruments lost their innovative edge under really critical bosses. It stifles everything.
Okay, wow, that's pretty bleak. Let's definitely open the windows, let some fresh air in. Now, Jim Collins' Good to Great study, the one looking at companies that made the leap and stayed great, found a totally different kind of leader.
Yeah, definitely not the larger-than-life types we've been talking about. These leaders were self-effacing people who constantly ask questions. Crucially, they had the ability to confront the most brutal answers. That is, to look failures in the face, even their own, but still keep faith they'd succeed.
Okay, so how does that map onto this idea of a growth mindset? What's the core connection there?
Collins found these leaders fundamentally operated from a growth mindset. They believed deeply in human development, in their own potential to grow, and in their people's potential. They were always trying to improve. They surrounded themselves with the best, most capable people they could find, not yes men. They looked honestly at their own mistakes,
Asking questions.
constantly asking, what skills do we need for the future? Their confidence wasn't based on some fantasy about their innate talent. It was grounded in the facts.
Can you give us a specific example of this kind of leader?
Sure. Alan Wurtzel, the CEO who turned Circuit City around, his nickname was the prosecutor because he relentlessly asked why in meetings. He wasn't trying to blame people. He was trying to understand. He saw himself as a plow horse, just a hard worker. But he took Circuit City from near bankruptcy to being the top performing stock on the NYSE for a time. That constant questioning, that was his growth mindset in action.
That makes me think of Andrew Carnegie, the industrialist who supposedly wanted his epitaph to read. Here lies a man who was wise enough to bring into his service men who knew more than he.
Exactly. That perfectly captures it. Growth-minded leaders see the company as an engine of growth for themselves, for the employees, for the whole organization. They talk about the journey, not about royalty. It's about building something together.
Let's look at Jack Welch at GE. He took GE from, $14 billion to nearly $490 billion in value over 20 years. He's often painted as this huge, commanding figure.
He was definitely impactful. But what's really key, according to people like Steve Bennett, who was CEO of Intuit, was Welch's deep commitment to nurturing employees. He was famous for constantly visiting factories, talking to frontline workers, learning from them directly. A total contrast to Ayakaka in his ivory tower.
And the focus on teamwork you mentioned earlier, that seems crucial.
It is. His own autobiography starts with him saying he hates using the word I, giving credit to all those colleagues and friends. He literally said, they often made me look better than I am.
That's a world away from the me of the fixed mindset leaders. It's all we and us.
But I heard he wasn't always like that he had his own fixed mindset battles early on.
That's absolutely right. He had to consciously work on it, root out his own fixed mindset. People saw him as arrogant early in his career, someone who couldn't take criticism, relied too much on just being smart.
So what changed him? He talks about having wake-up calls. One was a literal explosion, an oil squirt incident that kind of reminded him he wasn't invincible, not larger than life. Later, the disastrous acquisition of Kidder, Peabody taught him a hard lesson about the razor's edge between self-confidence and hubris. Through all that, he learned that real self-confidence isn't arrogance. It's the courage to be open to welcome change and new ideas regardless of their source. That's pure growth mindset.
And how did that personal shift translate into changes at GE?
It changed everything. He learned from a supportive boss early on how to handle mistakes constructively, not hide them. He started picking people based on their mindset, their inner hunger, not just their resumes. He apparently got the CEO job partly by promising to develop himself in the company. He opened up communication lines, attacked elitism. He even turned some exclusive executive retreat into a huge community volunteer force.
That's quite a statement.
It was. And critically, he got rid of brutal bosses. He instituted a policy to fire the bottom 10% of managers based on values, even if they hit their financial numbers. He rewarded teamwork, not just individual stars.
Okay, let's switch to Lou Gerstner at IBM. You mentioned IBM in the late 80s sounded a bit like Enron: smugness, elitism, turf wars, not caring about customers.
Yeah, he was in bad shape. Gerstner came in to turn it around, and he was a big believer in personal growth and building a corporate culture around it. First thing he did, opened up communication. And like Welch, he dedicated his book not to himself, but to the real heroes, the IBM employees.
So how did he tackle that fixed mindset culture he inherited? What were the key moves?
He went right after the elitism, disbanded the all-powerful management committee, started seeking input from everywhere. He forced teamwork by tying executive bonuses to overall IBM performance, not just their little silo.
Hitting them in the wallet.
Exactly. Stop the internal divisions from basically competing against each other. He demanded execution over just looking smart, famously said, "Genius is not enough. We need to get the job done."
Right.
And he put the customer back at the center, cut prices, declared, "We serve at the pleasure of our clients." Total shift in focus.
And the results speak for themselves.
They do. Wall Street was doubtful at first, called it a marathon, but Gerstner kept at it. By 2002, IBM's stock was up 800%. They were #1 globally in key IT sectors, shaping the industry's future. Quite the turnaround.
Then there's Anne Mulcahy at Xerox. In 2000, Xerox was facing potential bankruptcy, $17 billion in debt, credit rating tanked, stock down from $63 to $4, dire straits.
Mulcahy, who had been at Xerox for years, basically had to reinvent herself into the CEO they needed. She went into this incredible learning mode, studying every single part of the business, spending weekends reading binders. She had to be tough. She delivered the cold, hard truth about how bad things were, and she oversaw cutting about 30% of the workforce.
Okay, so tough cuts. Was she just another chainsaw Al? How's she different?
Fundamentally different. The description used is tough but compassionate. She apparently bore the emotional brunt of those layoffs. She walked the halls, personally apologized to people, worried about the remaining employees and retirees.
That takes a toll.
Huge toll. But she also protected unique parts of Xerox culture, refused to get rid of raises entirely, and even gave employees their birthdays off, a small thing, but a huge morale-boosting gesture when things were bleak. She showed you can be accountable and care about your people.
And again, the results followed.
Absolutely. Within 3 years, Xerox had 4 straight profitable quarters. Mulcahy was being called the hottest turnaround act since Lou Gerstner.
Looking at Welch, Kirshner, Mulcahy, what's the common thread? What's the big takeaway from these growth-minded leaders?
I think it comes down to this. They believed leadership is about growth and passion, not just about being inherently brilliant. And notice the contrast at the end. The fixed mindset leaders often ended up full of bitterness. These growth-minded leaders, they were consistently full of gratitude for their people, calling them the real heroes. That shift from ego to gratitude is huge.
It's also interesting you mentioned Jim Collins's original good to great leaders were all men. But things are changing, right? More women like Meg Whitman at eBay taking top spots.
Yeah, thankfully the landscape is evolving. Hopefully it means finding those purely fixed mindset leaders at the very top will become harder and harder, regardless of gender. Okay, so shifting gears slightly, let's talk about building these growth mindset organizations. Our sources point out a big reason why a lot of corporate training just doesn't work.
Why is that?
It often comes down to the managers. If they have a fixed mindset, they simply do not believe in personal change, not in their employees, and maybe not even in themselves.
So they won't invest in coaching or take feedback.
Exactly. They're less likely to coach effectively, and they're less likely to welcome critical feedback about their coaching. Why bother if people can't really change anyway?
So if the managers themselves have this fixed belief, how can you possibly run effective training or development programs? What actually makes a difference?
Well, the key is fostering that growth mindset in the managers. Growth mindset managers. They're naturally committed to development. They give more useful coaching. They actually notice when people improve, and they see critiques as chances to learn. And here's the really important part. The growth mindset itself can be taught.
You can teach people to have a growth mindset.
Yes, workshops that focus on things like brain plasticity. The science showing our brains can change and grow these can actually make managers more effective coaches quite quickly. It helps them see that change is possible.
That's fascinating. And does this apply beyond just managing people? What about other core business skills like negotiation?
Absolutely. There are studies showing this clearly. Teach people a growth mindset about negotiation, that it's a skill you can develop and they behave differently. In one study, 88% of those taught the growth mindset chose tasks that would actually improve their negotiation skills, compared to only 12% of the fixed mindset group.
They wanted to learn, not just look good.
Precisely. And in actual negotiations, they performed almost twice as well. They persisted through difficulties, they were more creative, found solutions that benefited everyone you know, baking a bigger pie instead of just fighting over slices. Even MBA students with a growth mindset got better grades in negotiation courses. They just learned it more deeply.
That's really compelling for individuals, but can a whole organization have a mindset beyond just the leaders or managers?
The research suggests yes. People within a company usually have a pretty strong sense of whether their organization operates from a fixed mindset, talent is fixed, we value natural brilliance, or a growth mindset, we have a culture of development. Skills come from effort and mentoring.
And what's the impact of that broader organizational mindset? What does it change for the employees day to day?
It changes a lot. Employees in growth mindset organizations report far more trust in their company. They feel a greater sense of empowerment, ownership, and commitment. They're just much more committed generally, more willing to go the extra mile. Why? Because they feel the company values their potential and their development, not just what they can do right now.
And innovation, that's the holy grail for so many companies today. How does mindset affect that?
It's the growth mindset companies that foster environments supporting risk-taking, innovation, and creativity. Makes sense, right? If mistakes are learning opportunities, people are more willing to try new things.
Whereas fixed mindset companies,
They tend to be rife with cutthroat or unethical behavior. Everyone's trying to look like the superstar, which means less collaboration, more backstabbing, not great for innovation.
that leads to an interesting point. How do supervisors in these different cultures actually view their own employees?
It's a night and day difference. Supervisors in growth mindset companies see their people much more positively. They rate them as more collaborative, more committed to learning, more innovative, and having far greater management potential. And here's the kicker, the real irony. Fixed mindset companies are always desperately searching for talent, right? But it's actually in the growth mindset companies that talent truly blossoms because everyone is given the chance and the support to grow.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, we've seen pretty clearly that mindset isn't just some fuzzy personal trait. It gets woven right into the fabric of organizations. It shapes leadership, innovation, ethics, everything.
Yeah, from Enron's collapse, which was just fueled by that toxic fixed mindset obsession with innate talent, to the amazing turnarounds at places like GE and IBM, driven by leaders who embraced a growth mindset. The evidence is really compelling, fostering development, openness, collaboration that seems to be the key to really thriving today.
So, for you listening, maybe take a moment to reflect on your own workplace. Do you feel like you're in more of a fixed or a growth mindset environment? And how do you interact with others? Are you sometimes acting like a fixed mindset boss, focused on judging and power? Or more like a growth mindset leader focused on development and teamwork?
Yeah, and if you lead a company, or even just a team, does it maybe need a bit of a Lou Gerstner treatment? Do you need to actively root out elitism, build more self-examination, foster real teamwork? Is your workplace maybe prone to groupthink? What could you do to encourage different views, constructive criticism, maybe assigning a devil's advocate sometimes, or just making space for healthy debate?
Good questions.
At the end of the day, the greatest leaders seem to agree. Leadership is something that's made, not just born, and it's made mostly through self-transformation, through embracing growth. Maybe the ultimate competitive advantage isn't just finding talent, but creating an environment where everyone feels they can truly grow and flourish.
So, the final thought for you is, what will you do to help cultivate that kind of environment, starting with yourself and then with the people around you?